The world loves loud success. Gold watches, towering skyscrapers, headlines shouting the latest billionaire's net worth. Yet, while the cameras were chasing the usual suspects, something extraordinary was unfolding in the shadows. In the heart of a booming consumer age, when fortunes were being forged in tech, oil, and real estate, one man quietly cracked open a global gold mine, then stepped away from the applause. His name? Chuck Feeney. To most people, it didn't ring a bell. There were no magazine covers bearing his face, no flashy interviews, no grand declarations, but behind closed doors, Chuck was building something massive, and he was doing it in a way the world wasn't used to. Raised in a working-class neighborhood in New Jersey, Chuck grew up during the Great Depression. He knew what it meant to scrape by. Maybe that's why, even when the tide turned in his favor, he never let the wealth stick to his skin. As a young man, he had hustle in his bones. After serving in the Air Force and studying at Cornell University thanks to the GI Bill, he teamed up with a partner and stumbled into a market few had considered: duty-free shopping. The idea was simple: sell luxury goods to international travelers, tax-free. But what Chuck and his team built was anything but ordinary. Duty-free shoppers, DFS, exploded across the globe, becoming the dominant player in airports from Hong Kong to Honolulu. It was a business built on precision, timing, and understanding the psychology of travelers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was wildly successful. And Chuck? He was at the center of it all, steering the ship, expanding the empire, and raking in billions. But unlike others in his league, he didn't move into penthouses or throw lavish parties. He didn't surround himself with an entourage. There were no yachts with his name stitched into the cushions. In fact, some people who worked with him didn't even realize he was a billionaire. He moved in silence. He dressed like a professor, not a tycoon. He took notes on yellow legal pads, not custom leather notebooks. And while DFS was becoming a cornerstone of international commerce, Chuck was already thinking beyond the money. He had built an empire, but what he intended to do with it would defy every rule in the billionaire playbook. The world didn't know it yet, but this quiet man with the common name was about to rewrite the story of wealth and redefine what it meant to truly succeed. Chuck Feeney was everywhere, and yet nowhere at all. While fellow tycoons were making headlines, buying sports teams, and launching rockets, Chuck moved differently, quietly, deliberately, invisibly. To the outside world, it almost looked like he had disappeared. But behind the curtain, something profound was unfolding. Even as duty-free shoppers expanded its global footprint, Chuck began distancing himself from the empire he'd helped create. He didn't crave the corner office. He didn't hunger for more control. In fact, he started stepping back, almost as if he were preparing for something else entirely, something bigger. Colleagues began to notice strange patterns. Business meetings would shift into philosophical conversations. Chuck wasn't talking about margins or market share anymore. He was asking questions about inequality, about education, about healthcare, in places few people cared to look. And then, one day, he made a move that stunned those closest to him. In complete secrecy, he transferred nearly all of his wealth into a private foundation. No press releases, no press conferences, no gala dinners to celebrate the act. Just quiet paperwork and a new mission. The foundation had a name: Atlantic Philanthropies. At first, its activities were difficult to trace. Funds began moving into hospitals, into scholarships, into human rights campaigns. Money was being funneled into countries most billionaires had never stepped foot in. And the amounts weren't small. They were staggering. But nobody knew where it was coming from. Even the recipients were baffled. Anonymous donations arrived out of nowhere, sometimes with a letter, sometimes with nothing but a wire transfer and a silent wish for them to do good. Questions were asked, rumors floated, but the benefactor remained a ghost. Chuck was orchestrating a global symphony of generosity, without asking for a single note of applause. He had chosen the shadows on purpose, not to hide from the law or from judgment, but from ego. He didn't want statues, awards, or buildings with his name carved into stone. He wanted impact, real, lasting change. And he believed the only way to do that was to stay invisible, so the spotlight would stay on the cause, not the giver. Behind this veil of secrecy, Chuck began reshaping the philanthropic landscape. The rich had always given, but rarely like this. Not this fast, not this boldly, and never with such humility. What no one knew yet, what even some of his closest allies were only beginning to suspect, was that this was only the beginning. The shadows had only started to move, and what they were carrying with them would one day shake the world. They called it a miracle. A small hospital in Vietnam suddenly received enough funding to upgrade its facilities. A rural school in South Africa got modern classrooms. A cutting-edge medical research institute in the U.S. was born seemingly overnight. But no one knew who was behind it all. No one saw the signature. No ribbon-cutting ceremonies. No oversized checks. No press conferences. Just quiet transformations. It began to feel like an invisible force was roaming the planet, dropping lifelines into struggling communities, lifting dreams out of the dust, and then vanishing without a trace. That force had a name, though few knew it: Atlantic Philanthropies. And at its heart was a man still choosing silence over recognition: Chuck Feeney. The foundation was growing into something unprecedented. It wasn't just giving, it was strategizing. It wasn't donating to feel good. It was investing to create change. And Chuck, despite having every right to be the public face of this movement, insisted on staying hidden behind the curtain. He gave in a way that made others uncomfortable. Not because it was wrong, but because it was different. This wasn't charity with strings attached. This wasn't legacy building. It was impact-driven, data-informed, and deeply human. Atlantic Philanthropies wasn't limited by borders. In Ireland, it quietly funded peace initiatives during tense and violent times, believing that reconciliation was more powerful than revenge. In Cuba, it helped strengthen public health systems long before it was politically convenient to do so. In the U.S., it backed healthcare reform, educational equity, and civil rights advocacy, often choosing causes that were politically risky, but morally urgent. What set it apart wasn't just the scale, it was the timing. While most wealthy individuals tucked away their money into endowments and planned to give it away after death, Chuck believed that tomorrow was too far away. Lives were at stake now. The philosophy took shape. Giving while living. He didn't want to wait to be remembered. He wanted to witness the ripple effects while he was still here. It wasn't about legacy, it was about life. Yet even as lives were changed across continents, his name remained missing from the plaques, the press, the praise. Chuck didn't want to be known as a generous man. He wanted the ideas to spread, not his image. And so the invisible hand kept moving, quiet, precise, and relentless in its pursuit of hope. It was only a matter of time before the world started asking questions. Who was behind it all? And more importantly, why? By the time Chuck Feeney's fortune had quietly crept into the billions, he could have bought anything. A fleet of private jets? No problem. Islands, penthouses, or marble-floored estates? All within reach. He could have lived like royalty. But instead, he made a decision that baffled even those who knew him well. He began giving it all away, and he started with his lifestyle. Chuck sold the mansions, the beachfront properties, the grand estates tucked in secluded luxury enclaves. He downsized not to something modest, but to something almost unthinkable for someone in his financial bracket. A rented apartment in San Francisco with no car and no extravagance. Just a bed, a desk, and a mission. He'd walk through the city unnoticed. No security detail, no designer labels, no signs of a billionaire. In fact, Chuck didn't even own a watch for years. He didn't need to impress anyone because he wasn't trying to be remembered. He was trying to make a difference. And then there were the flights. While his peers zipped across the sky in Gulf Streams and leather-clad luxury, Chuck preferred a middle seat in coach. He didn't care for comfort, he cared for cost. If flying coach meant he could reroute another few $1,000s into a scholarship fund or a rural clinic, that was the obvious choice. His colleagues recall moments that almost felt surreal. Watching Chuck scribble giving plans on napkins mid-flight, he crafted new ways to solve problems the world had overlooked. The world was watching other billionaires make bold purchases. Chuck was quietly unpurchasing his life. Every item sold became another step toward his goal, maximizing the good he could do while he was still alive to see it happen. It wasn't about punishment. He wasn't trying to be a martyr. It was about clarity. To Chuck, possessions were distractions. They took up space, not just physically, but mentally. Every dollar tied up in a luxury item was a dollar not building a school, not training a doctor, not healing a broken system. He saw the math differently. Those around him were stunned. Some admired it, others questioned it. But no one could ignore the stark simplicity of it. This was a man who truly meant it when he said money should be used, not worshipped. And while his bank account shrank, something else grew. Respect, quiet admiration, and perhaps most importantly, a radical example of what it looks like to live your values every single day. But not everyone applauded. As Chuck gave more and gave faster, whispers of concern began to rise from the edges. The next chapter reveals the growing tension around a philosophy that was turning the rules of wealth upside down. The numbers were shocking. Tens of millions, hundreds, then billions. Chuck Feeney wasn't just giving, he was emptying, and fast. Inside boardrooms, advisors whispered, was this wise? Was it sustainable? Had he thought it through? Outside, others raised eyebrows too. Wealth, after all, had its rules. You preserved it. You invested it. You passed it on. You didn't just liquidate it in real time, watching your fortune fade like morning mist. But Chuck was doing exactly that. And he was doing it with purpose. To him, giving later was too late. He had no interest in joining the long parade of billionaires who left their wealth to foundations after death, letting others decide what to do with it. He wanted to be part of the solution now, while he was still breathing. So, the battles began. First came the personal ones. People he trusted, lawyers, consultants, close friends, worried. They admired him, but some feared he was acting recklessly. You'll burn out the fund, they warned. You'll have nothing left. Chuck didn't flinch. That was the point. Then came the ideological battles. His giving while living philosophy didn't fit into the comfortable mold of legacy philanthropy. It disrupted it. While others were fine giving 5% a year, Chuck sometimes gave 5% in a single meeting. That level of urgency made institutions nervous. It also made some donors uncomfortable. Why not just wait until the end? Why not pace it out? Why not leave something behind? But Chuck wasn't interested in leaving something behind. He was interested in changing something while he was here. His response was simple, almost childlike in its clarity. I want to see the results. I want to enjoy the impact. He didn't just write checks. He rolled up his sleeves. He visited schools, sat in hospital waiting rooms, met with nurses, students, and grassroots organizers. He asked hard questions, not as a donor, but as a partner. And when something didn't work, he fixed it or funded it until it did. And still, he accelerated. From New York to Vietnam, from Belfast to South Africa, Chuck's foundation kept expanding. With every grant, he pushed the boundaries of what people believed one man could do, not just with wealth, but with vision. But even visionaries face limits. The faster he gave, the more people began to ask, how much longer could he keep going? That question wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. Because when a man refuses to stop giving, what happens when there's nothing left to give? The answer, emotional, radical, and unexpected, was just around the corner. For decades, Atlantic Philanthropies had been a silent force, powerful, precise, and relentlessly compassionate. It had seeded change in nearly every corner of the world, funded peace where there was conflict, built schools where there was neglect, backed science, justice, health, and hope, always quietly, always with intention, always with Chuck's signature absence. But even the most generous river must one day reach the sea. By the early 2010s, the numbers were staggering. The billions were almost gone, not lost, not wasted, deployed, used like tools. A fortune that had once towered silently in the shadows had now touched millions of lives, without ever demanding a spotlight. And yet, Chuck wasn't done. His final act wouldn't be a final donation. It would be something deeper. Letting go. It started with a decision few philanthropists ever make, to shut it all down. Atlantic Philanthropies wouldn't become a legacy institution. It wouldn't drift on for decades, growing smaller, slower, and safer. It would end. On purpose. On schedule. While it still had energy, and Chuck still had breath. Winding down the foundation meant more than closing an office or finishing paperwork. It meant saying goodbye to a family of collaborators who had spent years building something that was never meant to last, but was always meant to matter. It meant turning off the machine that had quietly moved mountains, and it meant embracing the unknown. Chuck had long said he didn't believe in safety nets. Not for himself, not for his wealth. Now he was proving it. As the last grants were made and the last plans were fulfilled, he watched his life's work reach its edge, not with regret, but with gratitude. He didn't mourn the money. He mourned the mission, only because there was still so much to fix in the world. But Chuck knew that for a new kind of giving to rise, his version had to end. And so, he made one final gift. He stepped back completely. He let the ripples carry forward without trying to steer them. He chose silence over summary, humility over headlines. There were no retirement speeches, no gala farewells, just a man, once a billionaire, now living modestly in a rented apartment, watching the seeds he had planted bloom far beyond his reach. In his final years, when asked what he thought about giving everything away, Chuck simply smiled. He had never seen it as giving it up. He had always seen it as giving it forward. But there was one chapter still left to write. A final moment, a quiet conclusion, not of a man's wealth, but of a life lived on purpose. It didn't make sense, not to the bankers, not to the executives who had once stood in awe of his empire, not to the journalists who pieced together fragments of his story years too late. How could a man who had built a fortune so vast, so global, so powerful, vanish from the billionaire lists entirely? No scandal, no bankruptcy, no collapse. Just one decision, carried out over decades, to let it all go. In his final years, Chuck Feeney lived in a modest apartment with simple furniture and even simpler habits. No valet, no art collection, no private chef, just a plastic watch, a handwritten notepad, and the company of his thoughts. Those who visited were often stunned by the contrast. They expected a legend, a mogul, a monument to success. Instead, they found an old man with kind eyes who offered tea and spoke about problems half a world away. Healthcare workers in need, students without scholarships, prisons overflowing with injustice. He still carried maps, notes, names. Even after the foundation had closed, he couldn't stop thinking about the work. He rarely spoke of the billions. If anything, he laughed at the idea that it had ever mattered. To Chuck, the wealth had only ever been a tool, one he had used to carve open opportunities for others. A ladder he built and never climbed again. There was no final speech, no televised farewell, no auction of memorabilia, just the slow, quiet fade of a man who had given until there was nearly nothing left to give. And that was the plan all along. Friends watched as his net worth approached zero. It wasn't an accident. It was an act of precision, a final gift, calculated with care. A disappearing act, not to escape, but to prove a point. That wealth is only powerful when it moves. That success means nothing unless it lifts others. That living rich means dying light. He didn't want a monument. He didn't need a statue. But without ever asking for it, he became something more. A quiet spark. One that slipped through the cracks of a noisy world and still lit fires in places no one thought to look.